Hello there and welcome to our special coverage of the Russia-Ukraine file. Russia's military operation in Ukraine on the 25th or 24th of February has fundamentally changed the geopolitical landscape with economic consequences. 4 weeks into the war, Russia continues its bombardment of cities, encountering determined Ukrainian resistance. While the outcome is highly uncertain, a lengthy political impasse appears likely. Economic damage to both countries will be substantial. Through sanctions, trade policies, and private investment decisions, Russia will be isolated for years to come. Ukraine must endure the massive displacement of people and destruction of property. This and more will be discussed with our panel of guests. We have via Skype Professor Abdel Toumi, Maghreb Studies expert from France, and Professor Benjamin Barton, Assistant Professor at Nottingham University from Malaysia, as well as Alexei Haran, who will be joining us later, a Professor of Comparative Politics in Kiev. And also here in studio, I have with me Hussam Barkan, also a journalist specialized in this file. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into discussion, here's the latest updates on the file. Agreement has been reached to try to evacuate civilians trapped in Ukrainian towns and cities through 9 humanitarian corridors on Wednesday. Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk said. French authorities say a convoy of rescue vehicles and emergency equipment is to leave Paris on Wednesday to be provided to Ukraine's emergency service. The UN says 10 million people have now fled their homes since the Russian military operation in Ukraine. I might begin with you, Professor Abdel. Is Russia repeating mistakes of past wars in Ukraine? Vladimir Putin may have anticipated a repeat of Russia's seizure of Crimea, but what we have seen is more similar to Chechnya. From Afghanistan to Chechnya and Ukraine, underestimating the will of the people. What's your comment?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me again. Yes, I mean, it is an underestimated outcome from the Russian side from the beginning of the invasion of the Ukraine. I think they missed, it's not fair to say understood, because they know well the culture and the people, the Ukrainian people. But on the other hand, they were thinking that they will be welcomed with flowers, and then they will launch an operation to gain or earn the hearts and the minds of the Ukrainians. However, all of these premises didn't go well. I will argue to the contrary, that what we are facing 3 weeks later, the Russians are facing a serious and fierce resistance, and which is, interestingly enough, because from the what we learned from this war or invasion, President Putin succeeded somehow to reunite or give birth to the Ukrainian nation and identity. Now, as far as the comparison with the previous wars that Russia launched in post-Soviet and during the Soviet era, for instance, in Afghanistan, I would say parameters are a little bit or slightly different, but more, on the psychological aspect, the Russians will be traumatized by this, because it looks like the war is continuing, and if President Putin thought that it will be a short war or just a quick operation and then we'll wrap up the story, it looks like we are going through a long war, and here will change entirely the imperatives of geopolitics, so that domestic politics as well.
Very nice. Professor Benjamin Barton, I might paraphrase this question. The Russians underestimated the will of the Chechens to defend their homeland. Similarly, Putin appears to have underestimated the will of Ukrainians to defend their country. What's your comment?
Absolutely. I think, as the previous speaker mentioned, Vladimir Putin underestimated the resistance of the Ukrainian people, and I think underestimated as well the resistance and the organization which the Western and European countries in particular would provide the Ukrainians, which is, proving to be really detrimental to Russia's military campaign. I think that perhaps Putin, perhaps his entourage, had a certain underestimation of the Ukrainian people. Perhaps he sensed that Ukrainians, as the previous speaker mentioned, would be, would welcome the Russians with open arms. Although that is in a way contradictory to the aims of this military operation, which is in part, to stop Ukraine drifting too far away from Russia geopolitically, culturally, economically, and so on. So it's, I think that definitely that resistance has been grossly underestimated by Putin, and indeed this is now looking like a conflict which is going to drag on into years.
Yes. And is the war in Ukraine a turning point for dissent in Russia, i.e. Russia will never be the same, Professor Benjamin Barton?
I think that there's not really much knowledge, I think, beyond Russia's borders of what life is really like in Russia. In a sense that, it's quite a closed community to the outside world. And as a result, we tend to assume that power in Russia is quite monolithic. That's the image which is projected, at least to the outside world. Of course, Alexei Navalny, for instance, who is the key figure in the opposition or the resistance internally in Russia to Putin, he is a figurehead which is quite well known internationally. But I mean, as a whole, is this conflict going to garner the kind of will amongst the Russian people to change the power structures in Russia? I mean, I think the Russian people already, it depends, of course, which level, which strata in society we're looking at, but they are, not necessarily, I think life is already hard enough
Yes.
for many of them in Russia. So do they have necessarily that will, triggered by the war, to want to overthrow the power and face up to the power? Given Russia's own complex history with democracy, I'm not so sure.
Yes, very nice. Abdel Toumi, you might actually comment about this. Are we going to see a different Russia after this?
I think in the short term, I don't think so, because I think it's still, there is this kind of nationalistic elements are taking place in Russia itself. However, it's very, very hard to say now how the Russians are pursuing this war because of the lockdown of the information channels and so on. But I am sure in the long term, it will be another, I would say, scenario that we saw during the withdrawal of the Soviet or Red Army from Afghanistan 32 or 33 years ago. And we all know what happened 2 years later to the entire Soviet Union. As now, on the democratic or the democratization process that might put in place in Russia, and again, it is too early. On the other hand, that is also one of the Western powers' aim, looking for this scenario, but they know well it's not going to happen anytime soon, because so far the ongoing war and the developments on the field don't let, to put these premises in front yet.
Very nice. And here with me in studio, we have Barkan Hussam, who is a specialized journalist who has been following the file intensively. Barkan, welcome to our studio. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Could you please tell us or enlighten us more about the on-ground developing situation?
First of all, thank you so much, Karim, for having me, and I would like to salute our distinguished guest also. So, Karim, you know that since the beginning of the special military operation by Russia and Ukraine, there has been two narrative of what's going on in the field. So, in order to give updates, we need to give two versions of the story. The story come from the east is saying that everything is going. The military operation is going as planned, and the narrative or the story coming from the West is saying that there are a lot of problems. There are a lot of logistic problems. There is a problem of morals. The soldiers are not doing great. So we need to shed the light on both stories. But one important thing that we should focus on is that unlike other wars, we can see currently that there are a lot of attempt to evacuate civilians. We witnessed a lot of ceasefires, and there are a lot of cities in Ukraine, a lot of cities, and a lot of cities where we witnessed that there is an evacuation of civilians, and also we witnessed that and so far about 10 million people fled Ukraine, which is something that we haven't witnessed since the Second World War. And to reach 10 million is something really huge. Karim, can you imagine that in 2015, with the war in Syria and withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, they reach about 3 million refugees in about 3 months. And here, we're witnessing 10 million refugees in about 1 month.
So it's a huge crisis, really.
It is.
Important.
Exactly. It's a huge crisis. And also one thing that I want to emphasize on is four important news that we witnessed the last couple of weeks. The first one is designating Qatar and Mexico as an important or strategic partner outside NATO. And the first one is diplomatic, and the second is military, which is the military exercises the United States in the Caribbean Sea with Mexico. And we also witnessed a war ship that passed through the Strait of Taiwan, between Taiwan and China. These two information, or these two pieces of knowledge that we heard about, are really important. You know, Karim, that when we talk about Qatar, a couple of years ago, the United States was labeling Qatar as a sponsor of terrorism. And today, after just 2 years, we witnessed that the United States is designating Qatar as an important and strategic partner outside of NATO, which is the highest diplomatic relation that the United States can give to grant to another country. The other country also is Mexico. Mexico currently is a strategic, a very important strategic partner outside of NATO. And for the first time, they conducted nuclear exercises using nuclear submarines. The United States has never done this before. This is the first time doing this. The other thing is the delegation that visited, the delegation from the United States visiting Venezuela. And you know that currently there is not only a war or the special military operation between Russia, between the East and the West, but there is also economical and petrol war, because you see that there were a lot of sanctions on the petrol of Russia. We noticed that there are 2 blocks that are forming currently, new blocks that are forming. The first block, and unlike what analysts and people expected, the new blocks are completely different. Can you imagine that the United States and Iran, which had a lot of problems and a lot of sanctions in the last 5 years, we can see and we can feel that there is some close relationship between the United States and Iran, and the United States are doing their best in order to get Iran back to the nuclear deal.
Very nice.
Can see that.
Which is justifiable. I suppose that the US is trying to, let's say, get so many people to side up with the US and to get as much support as possible in order to, let's say, make Russia seem the bad guy. Perhaps Professor Benjamin Barton would like to comment on this. Why is USA trying so hard to get so many countries on its side, especially those like Hossein Berkan has just mentioned that maybe they had conflict with before, or they labeled them as states that finance terrorism?
as mentioned, I mean, the aim is to corner Russia. I mean, how many real allies does Russia have outside of its borders? Belarus is one, and we're talking allies, those who would perhaps entertain going into war with Russia, either by will or by force. We cannot call China an ally of Russia's, because China will never adhere to that kind of a title in the context of its bilateral relations with Russia. They are close, of course, don't get me wrong. And then there's a host of other states, some who are considered to be pariahs by the international community, others who are not, who have, on and off good relations with Russia, but not to the extent where they would be willing to put their reputations on the line for Russia. I mean, obviously, I think the point made earlier about states such as Qatar, Venezuela, and Iran, yes, these are interesting developments, and no doubt the current geopolitical climate has facilitated the United States moving closer to those countries. But I wouldn't personally go so far as to say that the United States and Iran have overcome the last 5 years of diplomatic.
Especially that lately, many analysts are saying that seeing the current development, the nuclear talks or the progress of nuclear talks have been stalled because of that. Professor Benjamin.
Well, I mean, yes, perhaps that there's progress, but to go to so far as everything is solved with Iran is, I think, is perhaps going a step too far. What President Biden has been doing, and this is maybe a separate topic to that of the war between Russia and Ukraine, is building bridges from the wreckage left under President Trump. And I mean, in the case of Qatar, for instance, you could say that the US can warm up to Qatar again because Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have put an end to the embargo on Qatar. So that's kind of facilitated its normalization. I suppose that's being used as a spring step by Doha itself, to kind of regain favor with some of its partners around the world, and has utilized this conflict as a way to show that it's also, willing to act as a responsible stakeholder.
Very nice indeed. Now, meanwhile, the bombing in the city of Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, which is not more than 50 kilometers from the Russian border, continues. The intense attacks caused the flight of a large number of the city's population of 2 million. Those who remain in the city are in a daily struggle for survival. Let's follow.
At least 500 people have been killed in the city of Kharkiv since Russia launched its special military operation in Ukraine on February 24. Ukraine's second largest city, located in the country's northeast, has been subjected to relentless bombardments by Russian forces for weeks.
10 minutes ago, they were firing like crazy. They were really pounding the area up the road. This is a residential area, and it happens a lot. Every half hour they reload.
Kharkiv has suffered constantly shelling by Russian forces. Although they have not been able to take control of the city, the bombing has caused catastrophic damage. Residents from the bombarded city shared their testimony, describing the situation as a cold hell.
There was terrible shelling. It was not a bam, more of a whistle. 3 terrible whistles. It's a cold hell.
I hope they will end this soon, so that our children can live. May Putin be gone.
Kharkiv, before the Russian operation last month, had about 2 million residents, including foreign students studying in its faculties. But today, no more than 500,000 remain, after the majority of the population has migrated to safer areas. Whoever wanted to stay did so with the aim of fighting the Russians or to provide assistance to those in need or who were unable to leave for financial reasons.
Professor Abdel-Nour Toumi, amid all these hostilities, President Putin has raised the threat of using nuclear weapons, and his spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, refused to rule out their use in an interview with CNN. He said, quote, "So if it is an existential threat for our country, then it can be used in accordance with our concept," end quote. Russia isn't obliged to use nuclear weapons since just last week Russia said it had launched its Kinjal Dagger hypersonic missile that can hit targets anywhere on Earth within an hour. Professor Abdel?
Yes. No, I think it's still just a part of the rhetoric, and that also another card, I mean, as superpower, Putin is using. But I think when he meant, because again, it is very, very dangerous, because when we speak about the use of the nuclear, that would be, I mean, retaliation from the other side. And then we all know how the consequences will be on not only the region, but eventually on the planet. I mean, there is here a key word, I would say it's kind of existential. And what does that mean? It is, I mean, behind this, there is all the sanctions or the avalanche of sanctions that have been imposed on Russia since the beginning of the war from the West, or notably the European Union and the US. And here again, it is a direct speech or a message to the US on, and I think this is how the elements on the ground or the developments on the ground will go in order to be able to, when they go or when they sit seriously on the negotiation table, I mean, both sides will be having something on the table to discuss, because lately it looks like, I mean, there are these talks, but lately it looks like on the Ukrainian side there is kind of a reticence because of the push that the Ukrainian authorities are getting from the West, and it looks like, I mean, the West is looking to push or to corner President Putin further and let him do to make a tactical mistake that will eventually give the West what is looking for from this, I would say, first round post-Cold War era.
Very nice. Professor Benjamin Barton, as Professor Abdel Toumi said, Russia just last week launched its Kinjal Dagger hypersonic missile that can hit targets anywhere within an hour. And seeing that Russia is a global leader in hypersonic missiles, whose speed, maneuverability, and altitude make them difficult to track and intercept, what can we get from this dangerous development?
I also basically think that this is part of a negotiation tactic more than, I mean...
So it's just showing muscles?
Yeah, I mean, of course, everyone knows that, Russia is one of the few nuclear powers. It actually has the largest stockpile of active nuclear weapons in the world. And I think that if you look at the way that the war is starting to pan out for Putin, things aren't going well. It's not to say that he won't achieve his short-term aim, but things are not looking good. And everywhere he looks, he's got the kind of net closing in on him. So one way to bring others to the negotiation table, or at least to create more leverage for himself and his regime, is to use the ultimate threat. I mean, a good example here would be looking at what the North Koreans do. Ultimately, when North Korea feels it's being cornered, when it's not being listened to, what do? They test their ballistic missiles, right? So, I mean, it seems like a last resort, and that's what I think is the indication that perhaps there's a recognition, even at the very highest level of government, that perhaps things are not going the way that Vladimir Putin had definitely planned. But yeah, I think for the time being, it's because the thing is, of course, when you talk about missiles of this nature, sure, indeed, Russia does have them and can use them, but others have them too. So I mean, it works both ways.
Very nice. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged Russia to end its absurd war, as he calls it, in Ukraine, warning that the conflict is going nowhere fast and that the Ukrainian people are enduring a living hell. Continuing the war in Ukraine is morally unacceptable, politically indefensible, and militarily nonsensical, according to Guterres. Why haven't we reached a compromise yet, despite the Zelensky's calls for talks? Ukraine's president reiterated his readiness to discuss a commitment from Ukraine not to seek NATO membership in exchange for a ceasefire. Professor Abdel Noor Toumi?
Yes, I mean, the reason why it is because President Putin is still insisting that he wants to capture or to take Kiev. I mean, even symbolically, because then here we will move when he goes or his team go to the negotiation table. They have something solid in their hands. I mean, to talk about. But so far, I mean, the resistance is again furious, and Putin miscalculated his operation. Actually, interestingly enough, if we are looking for like sports metaphor, I mean, he started team for sprints, it ended up to be in a marathon. So this is why President Putin is now in a panic mode, and also the West, it looks like its tactic is the West tactic is working well for them, even though there are these these economic repercussions and these geoeconomics aspect that we earlier mentioned, Qatar, Venezuela, and eventually Iran. I mean, we all know it's all about the subsidies of oil and gas. So on the other hand, also, President Putin knows well the West, and he knows they need his gas. So this is why today he's keeping pushing and again pressuring on the field, because, for instance, like just here in France, I mean, the French are totally panicking. I mean, they don't. I mean, on one hand, politically speaking, they are geopolitically also they're sending this strong message that for being pro-Ukraine and showing support to Ukraine. And by the way, President Zelensky, he will be speaking to the French parliamentarians this afternoon, but it's still symbolic. But on the other hand, we all know that, I mean, Renault is still there, I mean, in Moscow, and the Total Energies are still pumping in Russia and so on. So this is why to end the war, as Secretary Guterres wanted, it's very hard. And also, on the other hand, it's the job of the UN. But we all know how the UN is divided. And again, with some respect, it is an irrelevant institution.
Yes. So we're still expecting things to get worse. Houssam Burkan, you just mentioned earlier that Russia is able to use its energy card, and we're going to enter a new era of energy war. What can you elaborate on that?
Exactly. So, Karim, you know that Europe is so dependent on the Russian energy, talking about gas. They receive more than, for example, a country like Germany receive more than 50% of its gas supply from Russia. And when it comes to oil, there are a lot of European countries who receive, who rely largely on the Russian oil. And Europe in general, energy in Europe, they rely a lot on Russia. So Russia currently is using this card against them. We noticed that the United States stopped exporting oil from Russia. And we noticed that the West in general was on the same line. But when it came to energy, we noticed also that countries like Germany, like France, there are a lot of European countries who refuse to follow the same line of the United States. And here we see that is a very important card that Russia can play. And there's another important update that we should emphasize on, Karim, which is that currently we've seen that a lot of countries are buying oil ready to buy oil from Russia using another currency. Just last week or a couple of days ago, can you imagine that India bought about 3 million barrels of oil from Russia using a ruble, the Indian currency? And we noticed a historic decision.
It's a counter-attack tactic used by Russian economists to perhaps keep the balance.
Yeah, for example, for the first time, we start hearing that Saudi Arabia is ready to had energy exchange with Russia using with China. Selling oil to China using the UN. It's the first time in history. So we notice that there is a change, and it goes back to the blocks that I told you about, the two blocks that they are forming, and they are surprising because allies of the United States. We're talking about the Gulf countries. We're talking about Saudi Arabia.
They're turning their back, and especially lately when they refuse to pump more production regarding oil.
Exactly, OPEC Plus. They're just following the deals of OPEC Plus, and they are currently they're trying to build bridges with Russia, and it's so surprising because these are the historic allies of the United States. We're talking about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and they're currently leaning a little bit toward the east.
Yes. We're joined actually by Alexei Harin, Professor Alexei Harin from Kiev. Alexei Harin, thank you for accepting our invitation and joining us. As you've been listening to our analyst here, Hussam Barkan, he was talking about some countries that are somewhat leaning toward Russia. What's your comment on this? We're seeing like some kind of a geopolitical balance that is changing.
Well, look, what I can say about geopolitical balance is actually that Russia appeared under sanctions. Putin didn't expect these sanctions. Nord Stream 2 is blocked. It's dead, actually. Nord Stream 2, a pipeline from Russia to Germany when Russians spent billions of dollars, is dead. And Europe decided to reduce its dependency on Russia. Moreover, there are other sanctions regarding Russia, disconnection from SWIFT, of different other banks and so, of Russian banks. So basically, Putin didn't expect it. Putin thought that the West wouldn't be united in conducting the sanctions against Russia, and that the West would not stop Nord Stream 2, but it happened. It happened because of Russia's actions. So yes, Russia is trying to reorient itself, but look, China, India, can they provide modern equipment which can be substitute for export to Russia from the West? Because Russia relies to a great extent its air industry, space industry, military industry, oil industry. It relies on innovations from the West. It relies on huge investments from the West. And now it's totally different situation. So definitely, yes, we see that China and India, they're trying to use this possibility actually to get Russian resources at decreased energy resources at decreased price, but they cannot substitute the Western technologies for Russia. You know, Russians air flights actually they have already stopped because they do not have spare details which were exported from the West. So many Russian companies stopped their operations. So it would not be easy to find a substitute, and they will not find a substitute. Actually.
Very nice.
So
we shall dive into further discussion, Professor Alexei Harin, if you may. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky denounced the inhumane conditions in the city of Mariupol, which he described as being under constant bombardment. He also reaffirms that his country will continue to work to push Russia towards peace. Let's listen.
As of today, there are about 100,000 people in the city of Mariupol, in inhumane conditions, in a complete blockade, no food, no water, no medicines, and a fire from constant shelling, under constant shelling. For more than a week, we have been trying to organize reliable humanitarian corridors for the residents of Mariupol, and almost all our attempts, unfortunately, are hampered by the Russian occupiers.
I get back to you, Professor Alexei Haran. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Kiev will be ready to discuss the status of Crimea and the eastern Donbas region, parts of which are held by Russian-backed separatists, after a ceasefire and steps towards providing security guarantees. How can the question of the territory, which is a large sticking point for both countries, be resolved while Russia is also calling for Ukraine's neutrality, which is also a central part of any negotiations to end the Russian military operation, as Russia prefers to call it, or the war as the West sees it?
I have already told in your programs that all Russia is saying about NATO is just a bluff. It's just a pretext. Why? Because in 2014, Ukraine was a non-bloc country officially, and Russia provided security guarantees to Ukraine, but Russia violated it. Russia attacked Ukraine at that time. Russia annexed Crimea and occupied part of Donbas. It's not controlled by Russian-backed separatists. Do not repeat Russian propaganda. It's controlled by Russian army since 2014. It's totally under control of the Russian regime, Russian police, and secret forces. So first of all, it's important to understand that it's not about NATO. There are no NATO missiles, bases, soldiers in Ukraine. This is first thing. Theoretically, we can discuss a security model outside of NATO, but if we are provided real guarantees, not paper type guarantees, because again, Russia attacked Ukraine twice in 2014, and Russia is waging the war right now. So we need security guarantees that it will not be repeated. Regarding territorial issues, there's no way that any Ukrainian government would agree to recognition of the Russian occupation of Ukrainian territories. By the way, I would like to stress that it's not recognized by the international community as well. No country in the world recognized annexation of Crimea. No country recognized the so-called puppet republics in Donbas. So Ukraine will not recognize it. That's for sure.
Okay.
So there's no doubt about it. And by the way, the resolution of the UN General Assembly, which demanded from Russia to stop the war and withdraw the troops without any conditions, was supported by 141 countries. Only 4 countries voted against this resolution. These are such countries as Northern Korea, Eritrea, Syria, and Belarus. That's all. All countries which are basically with dictatorial regimes, but even allies of Russia, like Nicaragua, Venezuela, others, they didn't vote against this resolution.
Okay,
so
perhaps I would like to hear Professor Barton's, sorry to cut your train of thoughts. Okay, so we all know that Russia launched what it calls a special military operation on February 24th, saying it aimed to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Kiev and its Western allies have accused Moscow of attacking civilians indiscriminately. Moscow denies targeting civilians. Now, according to the UN, some 10 million Ukrainians have fled from their homes, and the reverberations of war were being felt globally, with skyrocketing food, energy and fertilizers prices threatening to spiral into global hunger crisis. Isn't this enough to cease hostilities and seriously negotiate? It's no longer a Ukraine and Russia problem, don't you think, Professor Benjamin Barton?
Well, indeed, the repercussions are global, but I mean, the fighting is driven by the Russians and the resistance is being put up by the Ukrainians. So I'd say that for the time being, it's those two sides which really matter. Of course, the West has brought its sanctions into the play, and that's escalated the conflict somewhat. But no, I mean, the two main actors which of concern are Putin's Russia and Zelensky's Ukraine. And both sides are, polar opposites for the time being of where they stand. And that's, in a way, understandable, particularly on the Ukrainian side, because this is an attack coming out from Russia, and the Ukrainians are simply defending themselves. In terms of what each party wants right now, And whether that's going to be enough to bring them together to find some kind of a compromise, we're still way off. Simply because, as a previous speaker mentioned, Putin got into this war thinking it would be over quite quickly. Now he's in for the long haul, and he needs to find a way out of this conflict.
Point clear.
At the same time,
Point clear.
one way out
Thank you,
of that
Professor Benjamin Barton. I would like to give a final word to Abdel Toumi, since we're running out of time. Abdel Toumi, in few words, please. Any final words?
Yeah, as I said, this war or this operation started with a sprint, and it's going to be a marathon. And I'm afraid in the future, or the near future, the Ukrainian war will turn into a proxy war, and we don't know, and things are going very bad. And also, we have to focus on the humanitarian aspect, and that all the people who are suffering a great deal from this war.
Thank you so much, Abdel Toumi. Thank you so much, Alexei Haran. Thank you so much, Benjamin Barton.
Yes, I need to say something.
Okay.
Yes,
but briefly, please.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Not a proxy war. We are defending ourselves. Russia is aggressor. We are defending our freedoms and our liberty. Full stop here.
All right. Thank you so much, Alexei Haran. Thank you so much, Hussam Barkan, for joining our studio. Special thanks to all our panel of guests. This is the end of our special coverage. Bye for now.